Clara Mae Whitfield pressed the barrel of her late husband's rifle against Wendell Price's chest in broad daylight on the steps of the First National Bank of Creston, Texas, with half the town watching. "You will not take my children's beds," she said. "Not today." Price didn't flinch. He smiled. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said softly, "that rifle isn't loaded. Your husband sold the ammunition 6 months before he died, just like he sold everything else." He was right. She knew it. And so did every soul standing on that street. If you've ever been that kind of broke, the kind where dignity is the last thing standing, stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. The rifle clicked on empty. Clara knew it would. She'd known it the moment she pulled it from beneath the floorboard that morning. Felt the hollow weight of it, the way it moved without resistance. A dead thing dressed up as a threat. But she'd carried it down Main Street anyway, because sometimes the only weapon a woman has left is the willingness to look like she isn't finished. Wendell Price took a single step back, not out of fear, she understood that now, but to give her room to feel how alone she was standing there. "Mrs. Whitfield." His voice was the kind of patient that made her skin crawl. "Why don't you come inside? We can discuss the particulars in private, out of the heat. We'll discuss them right here." "Suit yourself." He opened his leather satchel with 2 fingers, the way a man opens something he's opened 1,000 times before. "The bank holds the deed on your property as collateral against your late husband's debts. Those debts total $412. The grace period expired yesterday. As of this morning, the property legally reverts. I know what the paper says. Then you understand my position. I understand you're about to put 2 little girls out of the only home they've ever known." Wendell Price looked at her the way a doctor looks at a patient who won't accept a diagnosis. "I'm doing my job, ma'am. No more, no less." She wanted to hit him. Not with a rifle, with her bare hands. She wanted to grab that leather satchel and scatter every one of those legal papers into the Texas wind and watch them blow all the way to the Red River. But Eliza was standing 20 feet away on the opposite side of the street, watching. 14 years old, and watching her mother with those careful, too old eyes that had learned to stay very still when things went wrong. Clara lowered the rifle. She lowered it slow, so it wouldn't look like surrender. But it was. "How long?" she said. "How long do I have?" Price tucked his papers away. 48 hours, out of professional courtesy. He tipped his hat and went back inside, and the door swung shut behind him. And Clara stood on those bank steps with an empty rifle, and 48 hours and nothing else. The crowd on the sidewalk didn't say a word. They looked at their boots. They found reasons to walk in the other direction. Creston, Texas was a town that watched you drown and called it not their business. She walked back to Eliza. "Mama?" Eliza's voice was flat, controlled. That control broke Clara's heart worse than crying would have. "How bad is it?" "Bad." "How bad?" Clara looked at her daughter. This girl who should have been worrying about boys and dances and whether her dress was pretty enough. Who instead had learned to read a ledger at 12 years old because someone had to. "We need to be out by Thursday morning." Eliza said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then, "Where do we go?" "I'm working on it." "Mama!" The control cracked, just a little, around the edges. "Where do we go?" "I don't know yet, baby." Clara put her hand on her daughter's shoulder. "But I will. I promise you, I will." She didn't know if that was true, but she said it like it was, because that's what mothers do. The widow Harriet Boone let them sleep in her back room that first night. Not out of affection. Harriet Boone wasn't a woman with much surplus affection, but out of a debt she felt she owed to Clara's mother, who'd once sat with her through a difficult winter when her own husband was dying. Clara accepted without pride. Pride, she'd decided 3 years ago when Daniel Whitfield drank himself into the ground and took every good thing with him, was a luxury she couldn't afford. She lay awake on a narrow cot while Eliza and little May slept beside each other under a single quilt, and she stared at the ceiling and did arithmetic she'd already done 100 times. There was no arrangement of numbers that worked out. She had $11 saved in a tin hidden in her boot. She had a horse, old, slow, but hers. She had a rifle with no ammunition, a sewing kit, and 2 daughters. That was the inventory of Clara Mae Whitfield at 34 years old. She was still staring at the ceiling at midnight when she heard a knock at the front door. She heard Harriet's voice, low and unhappy. A man's voice, quieter. Then Harriet's footsteps, and the door to the back room opened 2 inches. "Clara, there's a man asking for you." "What man?" "Says his name is Jasper Harrington. Says he's got a proposition." She'd heard that word before. Men with propositions had come calling twice since Daniel died. Both times, the proposition had been some variation of the same thing, dressed up in different language. She'd shown both of them the door. "Tell him it's midnight." "I told him. He said he knows, and he's sorry for the hour, and if you'd give him 10 minutes, he'd be grateful." "Who is he?" Harriet was quiet for a moment. "He's a drover. Comes through Creston twice a year buying cattle. Quiet fellow. Never caused trouble. That's all I know." Clara sat up in the dark. Eliza stirred, but didn't wake. May was breathing slow and even, one arm thrown over her sister's waist, the way she always slept. She got up. She smoothed her dress, tucked her hair, and picked up the empty rifle out of pure habit. Then she went to the front room. The man standing just inside Harriet's doorway was tall, and that was the first thing she registered. Not threatening tall, just the kind of tall that made rooms feel smaller. He had dark hair gone early to silver at the temples, a beard that was 2 weeks past a razor, and the kind of hands that told you everything about a man's life without him saying a word. These hands had worked. These hands had worked hard and long and in weather that didn't cooperate. His clothes were rough canvas and worn wool. His boots were functional, not decorative. He held his hat in both hands, and he was not smiling, which she appreciated more than she could have explained. "Mrs. Whitfield." His voice was low and careful. "I apologize for the hour. I'll be gone before sunrise, and I didn't want to miss my chance to speak to you." "Speak then." He didn't flinch at her tone. "I'm in need of a wife." Clara looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Harrington, is it?" "Yes, ma'am." "It's midnight. I'm standing in another woman's front room. I watched a lawyer smile at me this morning while he took my home, and you're standing here telling me you need a wife." She kept her voice level. "You have exactly 10 minutes to explain why I shouldn't walk you back out that door right now." He nodded, as though that was a reasonable response. "Yes, ma'am. I'll be plain." "Please." "I have a ranch. It's north of here, up in the hill country, and it's substantial. I won't lie to you about the size of it. There'd be no point. It's a working operation. Cattle, some horses, timber on the high ground. I run it with 20, 30 hands depending on the season. I've run it alone, without a wife, for 7 years. He paused. "I need that to change." "Why?" "That's the part that takes longer to explain." "Then start explaining." He looked at her steadily. He had dark eyes, brown so deep they were almost black in the lamplight, and they were doing the same things she was doing: reading, assessing, filing away information. I have business partners in San Antonio who've been pressing me on a contract dispute. The dispute involves a substantial amount of land that borders my northern range. In the territory courts, a married man with an established household carries different legal weight than a single man living alone. You want legitimacy? Partly. What's the other part? Something shifted in his expression. Not much. Just enough to tell her there was a real person underneath the careful speech. I have a daughter, he said. She's 12 years old. Her mother died 4 years ago. She's been living at the ranch, being raised by my housekeeper, who is a fine woman, but who will be the first to tell you a housekeeper isn't a mother. He stopped, started again. My daughter needs a woman in the house who isn't paid to be there. Clara was quiet. I'm not asking for love, he said. I'm not asking for anything that isn't your choice to give. What I'm asking for is a legal marriage, your presence at the ranch, and your willingness to be honest with me. He reached into his coat and set something on Harriet Boone's table. A bank draft. That would clear your debts, all of them, whatever price is holding over you. She looked at the draft, then back at him. What's the number? $500. The number sat in the air between them, like a third person in the room. And if I say no? She said. Then I leave, and we never spoke. And if I say yes, and then decide I made a mistake? He picked up his hat and turned it once in his hands. Then we figure out something fair. I'm not interested in trapping you, Mrs. Whitfield. A trapped woman isn't a partner. She's a problem. He looked at her directly. I watched you on those bank steps this morning. I was across the street. Clara felt something cold move through her. You were watching me? I was in town for supplies. I wasn't there for you, if that's what you're thinking. But I saw you, and I saw what you did. And I thought, he paused, a woman who'll carry an empty rifle in public rather than surrender without a fight is a woman who understands what matters. That's the kind of woman I need at my ranch. You could have introduced yourself this morning. Broad daylight, normal hours. I could have. He didn't apologize for it. But I needed the rest of the day to decide if I was going to make this offer at all. She almost laughed. Almost. You needed to decide, while I was spending the afternoon figuring out where my children would sleep. Yes, and I'm aware that's not a comfortable thing for me to admit. His voice was level, but something in it had changed. Something that sounded, oddly, like honesty. I don't make this kind of offer easily. I haven't made it at all in 7 years. I needed to be sure. Clara looked at that bank draft on the table. She thought about Eliza's face on the bank steps. She thought about Mae, who was 6 years old and still believed the world was essentially kind because nobody had proven otherwise yet, and who would find out the truth in about 48 hours if things kept going the way they were going. She thought about Daniel, about what it felt like to trust a man and be wrong. If I agree, she said slowly, I have conditions. Name them. My daughters come with me. Of course. My name stays my own in practice, whatever the legal paper says. You don't speak for me in my own house. He nodded. I want to know, before I go anywhere, the real reason you need a wife. Not the legal argument, not your daughter. The real reason. She kept her eyes on his. Because there's always a real reason, Mr. Harrington. And I've learned the hard way that it's better to know it up front than to find it out sideways. The room was very quiet. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that Harriet Boone shifted uncomfortably in the doorway, and the lamp flickered in a draft from somewhere. My sister, he said finally, believes she has a claim on the ranch. She's been working with her husband's lawyers to establish that my father's estate was mishandled, that I took more than I was entitled to when he died. If she succeeds, I lose controlling interest in everything I've built. He met Clara's eyes without flinching. A stable household, a wife, a family presence on the land. It complicates her legal argument considerably. It's not the whole reason I want to marry, but it's the part I'd rather have told you than have you find out later.
And your daughter, she's real?
You weren't using her to soften the offer? He looked almost pained. Hannah is real. She is the realest thing I have. Clara picked up the bank draft. She looked at it for a moment. Then she set it back down. I need until morning, she said. I need to talk to my daughter. The older one? Yes. He nodded. I'll be at the livery at sunup. If you're there, we'll talk terms. If you're not, I'll ride out and we're done. He put his hat on. Mrs. Whitfield, I won't pretend this is a normal arrangement, but I promise you this. I'll be straight with you. Everything I've told you tonight is the truth. There's more to know about me and about the ranch, and you'll find it out. But nothing I've told you is a lie. That's a low bar, Mr. Harrington. It is. He said it without argument. But in my experience, it's rarer than it ought to be. He left, and the room was quiet again, and the bank draft was sitting on Harriet Boone's table like a question nobody had answered yet. Eliza was awake. Clara knew it the moment she stepped back into the room. Knew it from the quality of the stillness, the too even breathing that was just slightly wrong. Go ahead, Clara said, sitting on the edge of the cot. Eliza opened her eyes. You're going to take it. I don't know yet. Mama, her voice was 14 going on 40. I heard everything. The walls aren't thick. Clara was quiet. Is he telling the truth? Eliza asked. I think so. You're not sure? No, I'm not sure. Clara looked at her daughter in the thin lamplight leaking under the door. I'm never going to be sure about a person in one night. But I've been wrong about people slowly, and I've been wrong about people fast, and I haven't noticed that slow is any safer. Papa was slow. The word landed like a stone in still water. Yes, Clara said. He was. Eliza sat up, pulled the quilt around her shoulders. What happens to us if you go and it's bad? I bring you home. There's no home. Then I find us one, same as I've have to do right now without him. Clara kept her voice steady. Eliza, look at me. Her daughter looked at her. I am not your father. When I make you a promise, I keep it. You understand me? Eliza held her gaze for a long moment. That careful, too-old measurement that Clara both hated and was fiercely proud of. Then, what's the ranch like? He didn't say much about it. Is it far? North, hill country, he said. Does he seem... Eliza stopped, started again. Does he seem like the kind of man who'd be mean to May? The question cut right to the bone of it, because that was the real question. That was always the real question with a 6-year-old in the picture. No, Clara said, and she meant it. No, he doesn't. Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then she lay back down and pulled the quilt up to her chin. Then go to the livery, she said. I'll pack in the morning. Clara sat with her daughters in the dark for a long time after that. May was breathing slow and even, dreaming whatever 6-year-olds dream when they don't yet know how precarious everything is. Eliza lay still and awake, doing the same arithmetic Clara had been doing, working the numbers of a situation that didn't add up to anything safe. But sometimes Nothing adds up to safe. Sometimes you just pick the least dangerous road and walk it. Jasper Harrington was at the livery at sunrise, same as he'd said. Clara was there 12 minutes before him, which she considered a point in her favor. She wanted him to find her waiting, not the other way around. She had Eliza beside her, and Mae on her hip, and one bag between all three of them, because there'd been nothing else worth carrying. He came around the corner of the livery and stopped when he saw the children. Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. "Miss Eliza," Clara said, not taking her eyes off Harrington. "Take your sister and look at those horses." Eliza went, pulling Mae by the hand, and Mae immediately pointed at a roan and started talking about its ears. "My daughters," Clara said. "I see that." He looked at the two girls, then back at her. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitfield." "I have 3 more conditions." "All right." "My daughters are never used as leverage." "Not in your legal fights, not in your family arguments, not in anything. They are children. They stay out of it." "Agreed." "If I discover you've lied to me, not withheld information, I understand that men are private. But if you've told me something false, the agreement ends. No argument, no negotiation. It ends." "Fair." "And the third," she looked at him steadily. "Your daughter, Hannah. I'm not going to be her mother, and I'm not going to pretend to be. I'll be honest with her the same as I'm being honest with you, and we'll figure out what we are to each other as we go. I won't force it." He was quiet for a moment. "She's going to test you," he said. "Children generally do. She's going to be more difficult than most. Mr. Harrington, I've spent 3 years keeping 2 daughters alive on very little while managing a dead man's debts. Difficult doesn't frighten me." He looked at her for a long moment, the way he'd looked at her the night before, that reading look. Then he said, "Do you know how to ride?" "Yes." "We've got a 2-day trip ahead of us. Hard country, some of it. You willing?" "I packed light on purpose." He almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, more like the shape of one that hadn't committed yet. He turned to a boy hovering near the stable door. "Bring out the bay and the gray," he said, "and the small pinto for the children." The horses came out. Mae gasped with delight at the pinto and immediately tried to climb its leg. Eliza grabbed her collar before anyone else had to. Clara didn't look at the bank draft in her coat pocket. She already knew she'd handed it to Harriet Boone to pass to Wendell Price that morning. The debt was paid. The land was still gone. It was too late for that. But the debt was paid, and the paper that had been hanging over her like an executioner's axe was gone. Whatever came next would come on its own terms. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up onto the bay, and the horse was solid and steady beneath her, and she gathered the reins and looked north. "Tell me about the ranch," she said. Harrington mounted the gray. "What do you want to know?" "How many people live there year-round?" 20, give or take. The core crew. Ruth Benson runs the household. She's been there since before I was born." He glanced at her. "She's the one who'll decide if you last." "She makes that decision?" "She's made every decision worth making in that house for 30 years. I learned a long time ago not to fight her on the ones that matter." He looked straight ahead. "She's a fair woman, strict, doesn't suffer pretense. If you're honest with her, she'll give you honest back. And if I'm not? Then you'll know it within a day, and it'll be unpleasant." He paused. "She came through slavery and the war, and she built herself a life on that ranch, piece by piece. She doesn't owe anyone patience. The fact that she still has some is a gift she chooses to give. Don't waste it." Clara listened to that and filed it away. "And your daughter?" When did she last have a woman in the house who wasn't staff? 4 years. Since her mother died? Yes. What was her mother like? The silence went on long enough that Clara began to think he wouldn't answer. Then, "She was brave," he said. "She was brave in a way that didn't account for consequences, which was sometimes wonderful and sometimes not." He kept his eyes on the trail. "Hannah is like her. I say that so you're prepared." Brave how? The kind of brave that picks fights it isn't sure it can win, just to see what happens. Clara looked at him sideways. "She sounds like Eliza." Behind them, Eliza said flatly, "I heard that." Harrington turned in his saddle, and for the first time he looked at Eliza directly. And Eliza looked back at him with that 14-year-old stare that had leveled grown men before. He held it for a moment. Then he nodded, once, like a man acknowledging an equal. Eliza said nothing, but she didn't look away either. Clara filed that away, too. They rode for an hour before he told her the first thing she hadn't asked about. "The ranch," he said, "when we get there. Don't let the size of it rattle you." She looked at him. "How big?" He was quiet for a moment. "Bigger than what I described last night." "How much bigger?" "Considerably." Clara kept her voice even. "Mr. Harrington, you told me last night you were a drover." "I said I come through Creston buying cattle. That's true." "You let me believe—" "I let you see what you saw," he said. "I didn't tell you I was poor. I didn't tell you I was just a working man. You assumed it based on what I was wearing and how I was traveling." He kept his eyes on the trail. "I've found that's a reliable test of character. When people think you've got nothing, they show you who they are." The anger came up fast and hot. She breathed through it. "And what did I show you?" "You showed me someone who asks hard questions instead of comfortable ones." He glanced at her. "You showed me someone who put conditions on an offer instead of just taking the money. Someone who made sure her daughter had a say." He paused. "That's what I was looking for, Mrs. Whitfield. Not someone who'd be impressed by what I own. Someone who'd have taken the offer even if it was just the ranch he described last night." "And if the ranch had been that small, would you have made the offer?" He thought about it, really thought about it, in a way that told her he was taking the question seriously. "I don't know," he said. "That's an honest answer. I don't know." She could respect that. She couldn't fully forgive the omission yet, but she could respect the honesty of not knowing. "How big?" she said again. He told her. She didn't say anything for a long time after that. She just rode north through the Texas hill country, with her daughters behind her and a stranger who wasn't quite what she'd thought beside her. And she looked at the sky, which was going from pink to gold, the way Texas skies do in October. And she thought about the difference between desperate and brave, and whether there was really any difference at all when you were moving this fast with this little information. Mae's voice floated up from the pinto behind them. "Mama, that cloud looks like a horse." "Does it, baby?" "It does. Mr. Harrington, does that cloud look like a horse to you?" Jasper Harrington looked over his shoulder at the 6-year-old pointing at the sky, and something crossed his face that Clara caught because she was watching. Something that had nothing to do with legal strategy or ranch business, or any of the complicated adult reasons that had brought them all to this road. "It does," he said quietly. "It looks exactly like a horse." Mae beamed. "I thought so." Clara faced forward again. The trail wound up into the hills, and somewhere at the end of it was a ranch she hadn't agreed to live on yet, and a daughter she hadn't agreed to love, and a man she'd married this morning with a circuit preacher and 2 witnesses, and no music and no flowers, and not a single word that wasn't practical. And Clara Mae Whitfield, who had buried one husband and carried his debts for 3 years and stood on bank steps with an empty rifle and still not surrendered. Clara Mae Whitfield rode north and told herself this was not the worst bet she'd ever made. She was going to find out, one way or another, if she was right. The ranch appeared the way truth sometimes does, gradually, then all at once. They'd been climbing for most of the second day, the trail narrowing through cedar and live oak, the air changing as they gained elevation, losing the flat heat of the lower country and picking up something cooler and older smelling. Clara had stopped asking questions around mid-morning, not because she'd run out of them, but because she was tired of receiving answers that opened into more questions. She rode, and she watched, and she filed things away. Harrington had said very little since the first morning. He wasn't a man who filled silence out of nervousness, which she was beginning to understand was unusual. Most men she'd known talked when they were uncomfortable. This one went quieter. She wasn't sure yet if that meant he was trustworthy or simply very controlled. Then they came around a long bend in the trail, and Eliza said, "Mama," in a voice that had lost all its flatness, and Clara looked up. The Harrington Ranch sat in a bowl of hill country that shouldn't have existed. A wide, grass-floored valley ringed by cedar ridges, with a creek running through the middle of it that caught the afternoon light. There were buildings, not a cabin and a barn, buildings, plural, substantial, organized with the logic of something that had been planned rather than accumulated. A main house of 2 stories, stone and timber, with a long covered porch running the full width of it. Barns, a bunkhouse, corrals with horses moving in them, smoke coming from 2 chimneys. May said, "Is that a castle?" "No, baby," Clara said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. Harrington had pulled his horse up beside her, without her noticing. He was looking at the valley the way people look at things they've loved for a long time. Not with pride exactly, more with the quiet relief of return. "You could have told me," Clara said. "Would you have believed me?" She thought about that honestly. A drover in worn wool, telling her he owned this. "No," she admitted. "Then I saved us both an argument." He clicked his tongue at the gray and started down the trail. "Come on. Ruth will have supper on." The closer they got, the more Clara's chest tightened. Not with fear exactly, but with the specific pressure of understanding the full size of what she'd stepped into. This wasn't a working ranch that needed a woman to manage a household. This was an operation. This had weight and history and momentum completely independent of her. A boy came running from the direction of the barn as they rode in, young, maybe 16, with a gap-toothed grin. 2 men appeared from the bunkhouse. A woman was already on the porch. The woman on the porch was the one Clara looked at. She was tall for a woman, broad in the shoulders, somewhere in her 60s, with close-cropped silver hair, and the kind of posture that didn't bother with commentary. It just existed and let you measure yourself against it. She wore a dark dress, a white apron, and an expression that Clara could not read at all. "Mr. Harrington," the woman said as they dismounted. Her voice was deep and even. "You're a day earlier than I expected." "Roads were good." Harrington handed his reins to the boy. "Ruth, this is Mrs. Clara Whitfield. Clara Harrington now, I suppose." He said it simply, not awkwardly, just as a fact being stated for the record. Her daughters, Eliza and May. Ruth Benson looked at Clara. Clara looked back. The examination lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It felt considerably longer. Ruth's eyes were dark and direct, and they moved with the efficiency of someone who'd had long practice at sorting people quickly into categories that mattered. "You hungry?" Ruth said. "Yes," Clara said. "Children?" "Starving," May announced. Eliza put a hand on her sister's shoulder. Ruth nodded once. Then she turned and went inside, the screen door swinging behind her. And that was apparently the welcome. "Is that good?" Clara said quietly to Harrington. "She asked about the children," he said. "That's good." Supper was in the main house kitchen, which was larger than anything Clara had cooked in, with a cast-iron stove that had 6 burners and a bread oven built into the side of it. Ruth moved around it with the efficiency of someone who'd stopped thinking about the movements years ago and just executed them. 3 ranch hands ate at the long table. The foreman, a solid Mexican man named Ernesto Reyes, who nodded at Clara with quiet courtesy. His wife, Nora, who sat beside him and studied Clara with open curiosity that somehow wasn't rude. And a lean, weathered man named Cal, who appeared to communicate exclusively in single syllables and seemed comfortable with this arrangement. Harrington sat at the head of the table. Clara sat to his right. The girls flanked her. No one said much through the first part of a meal. Ranch people understood that food came first. It was Mae who broke the silence, the way Mae always broke silences, with complete disregard for whether the silence was intentional. "Do you have a little girl here?" she asked Harrington, over a mouthful of biscuit. Everyone at the table went still in a specific way. The way people go still when a child says something true that adults had been carefully not saying. "I do," Harrington said. "Where is she?" "She'll be along." "What's her name?" "Hannah." "How old is she?" "Mae," Eliza said. "I'm just asking." 12, Harrington said, and his voice was even, but something underneath it had shifted. Something careful. "She knows you're here. She'll come when she's ready." Mae accepted this with the simplicity of 6 years. Eliza accepted it with the wariness of 14. Clara filed it away, along with everything else. After supper, Nora Reyes fell into step beside Clara as they moved through the hallway. "You need anything," Nora said, low and direct, "you come to me first, before you go to anyone else." She said it without preamble, without building to it, just dropped it like a fact and let it sit there. Clara looked at her. "Why?" "Because I've been on this ranch for 10 years, and I know where everything is and how everything works. And because you look like a woman who's used to doing things herself, which is fine, but doing things yourself in a place you don't know yet will just make you tired." She paused. "Ruth runs the house. She's fair, but she tests people." Another pause. "She tested me for 6 months before she handed me a key." "A key to what?" "The pantry." Nora's mouth curved slightly. "On this ranch, that's significant." Clara almost laughed. It surprised her. "How long before she stops testing me?" "Depends on how you do." Nora's voice was neutral, not unkind. "She liked that you didn't exclaim when you saw the house." "I was trying not to." "I know." She knew too. She liked it anyway. Nora turned toward the door. "Ernesto and I are in the second house, past the barn. Knock any time." She left, and Clara stood in the hallway of a house that wasn't hers, listening to her daughter's voices from somewhere upstairs, where Ruth had apparently decided to put them. And she pressed her back against the wall and breathed for a moment. Just breathed. She'd been in motion for 2 days. She'd been in motion, really, for 3 years. It caught up with you, the motion, when you stopped. "Mrs. Harrington." She turned. Ruth was standing at the end of the hallway with a lamp, looking at her without particular judgment. "Your room is ready. 2nd floor, east end. Mr. Harrington is in the west." "Thank you." Ruth didn't move. "Your girls are settled. The little one is already asleep. The older one is reading. I gave her something from the shelf. I hope that's all right." "That's very kind." Another pause. Ruth was measuring something. "I've been in this house since before Jasper Harrington was born," she said. "I was here when his father built it. I was here when his mother died, and when Jasper went off to the war, and when he came back, different from it." She kept her eyes level. "I was here when his wife died, and when he stopped sleeping through the night." Clara waited. "I'm telling you this," Ruth said, "so you understand that I am not indifferent to how this goes." She lifted the lamp slightly, illuminating the lines of her face. "He needs someone who won't be managed, Mrs. Harrington. He's very good at managing people. His father taught him. And what his father taught him has served him well in business and done him no good at all as a human being." She paused. "You push back on him." "I intend to." "Good." Ruth turned toward the stairs. "The girl is harder, Hannah. She's been—" She stopped, chose the word carefully. "She's been waiting for her father to stop needing her to be fine." Clara followed her toward the stairs. "And is she fine?" "No," Ruth said. "She is 12 years old, and she hasn't cried in front of anyone since her mother's funeral. That's not fine. That's a performance." She started up the stairs, her hands steady on the railing. "She's going to make you earn everything." "I know." "You don't yet, but you will." At the top of the stairs, Ruth turned. "Don't try to be her mother. She'll cut you off at the knees, and she'll be right to do it. Be something else. Figure out what that is." She indicated a door at the end of the hall. "Sleep. Tomorrow starts early." She went the other direction, and Clara stood at the top of the stairs in a house that was not yet hers, in a life she'd signed on to 48 hours ago, in a marriage that was a contract and nothing else yet. And she was tired in a way that went past her bones and into something older. She went to her room. She did not cry. She lay in a bed that was softer than any bed she'd slept in since before Daniel Whitfield spent their money on whiskey and bad investments. And she stared at the ceiling and thought, all right then. We start here." She was asleep in 4 minutes. Hannah Harrington appeared at breakfast the next morning. Clara heard her before she saw her. Quick footsteps on the stairs, and then a pause just outside the kitchen doorway that lasted a beat too long, and then the girl came in. She was small for 12, which Clara hadn't expected from a man Harrington's height, with dark hair that wanted to go in several directions at once and hadn't quite been persuaded into the braid she was wearing. She had her father's eyes, that same dark brown, that same quality of observing and cataloging simultaneously, but set into a face that was all angles and unresolved feelings, the way 12-year-old faces are when the person inside them hasn't finished deciding who they're going to be. She sat down across the table from Clara, and she did not say good morning, and she did not look away. Clara poured her coffee. "You must be Hannah. You must be the woman my father married in 2 days." Eliza looked up from her plate. "That's right," Clara said. "Why?" "Because he asked me, and I said yes." "Why'd you say yes?" "Hannah!" Harrington's voice came from the doorway, warning in it. "It's a fair question," Clara said, without looking away from Hannah. "I said yes because I needed help, and he offered it honestly, and I believed him." "You believed him after 2 days." "I believe people quickly when they're straight with me. I've found slow trust doesn't protect you any better than fast trust. It just takes longer to be disappointed." Hannah was quiet for a moment, processing that. "My mother used to say something like that." "What did she say?" Hannah's jaw tightened. "Nothing. Never mind." She looked at Mae, who had been eating steadily through this entire exchange with profound indifference to its emotional content. "How old are you?" 6, Mae said, through a mouthful of eggs. "What's your name?" "Mae Whitfield, But Eliza says it might be Mae Harrington now. I don't know yet.
Eliza's your sister?
Uh-huh. Mae pointed with her fork. That's her. She doesn't talk much in the morning. Eliza gave Hannah a look that communicated several things without words. Hannah looked back with an expression that acknowledged receipt of all of them. You can ride? Hannah asked Eliza. Yes. How well? Well enough. I'll take that to mean not very. It wasn't particularly mean. It was just direct, in the way of someone who'd grown up on a ranch and had no patience for vague answers about practical skills. I can teach you the property lines this afternoon if you want, so you don't get lost. Eliza considered this. All right. It wasn't friendship. It wasn't even the beginning of friendship, but it was two girls deciding to tolerate each other toward a practical end. And Clara had raised Eliza, so she understood that with her daughter, that was sometimes how friendships started. Clara found Harrington in the barn after breakfast. He was checking a horse's left foreleg with the focused attention of a man who preferred physical problems to any other kind. She came and stood nearby and waited until he looked up. She's testing the leg, he said. Slight swelling, probably nothing. Hannah came to breakfast. I heard. She's direct. She's like her mother. He straightened. Too much? No. Clara leaned against the stall post. I want to ask you something. Go ahead. Your sister, Dorothy. When does she move? He looked at her. What do you mean? You told me she's been building a legal case. You told me a married household complicates her argument. But you didn't tell me her timeline. Does she have a filing date? A hearing scheduled? He was quiet. Jasper. It was the first time she'd used his name. She watched him register it. A slight shift in his posture, not much, just enough to tell her it landed. You told me last night that you'd be straight with me. I'm asking you a straight question. When does she move? 6 weeks, he said. She filed a petition 3 months ago. The hearing is in 6 weeks in San Antonio. The air in the barn was dusty and warm and smelled of horse and hay. Clara counted 6 full seconds before she trusted herself to respond without the anger getting into her voice. You married me with 6 weeks to the hearing, she said. Not because a wife helps your standing generally, because you needed to be able to present an established household at a specific hearing in a specific amount of time. He didn't look away. Yes. Say that again without the barn between us hiding your expression. He stepped forward, out of the shadow of the stall, into the light coming through the barn door, where she could read him properly. Yes, he said. The timeline is the hearing. I won't apologize for the timing because I can't change it, but I am telling you straight, here, now, because you asked. How many other timelines are there that I don't know about? He thought about it. That honest, irritating pause where he actually considered the question instead of deflecting it. 2, maybe 3, that you'll need to know about before the hearing. I'll tell them to you before the week is out. You'll tell them to me today. His jaw shifted. Clara, today, she said. Not because I'm demanding every secret you have. Because I cannot walk into that hearing and be surprised by something you knew and didn't tell me. That's not protecting me. That's managing me. And you need to decide right now which one you're doing. Something happened in his face. Not softening exactly. More like a defense being considered and then voluntarily set aside. Today, he said. Thank you. She turned to leave. He said, You're not rattled. She stopped. Should I be? Most people would be. She looked at him over her shoulder. Mr. Harrington, I pressed an empty rifle against a bank lawyer's chest 3 days ago. I need more than a family lawsuit to rattle me. She paused. What time should I come to your office? After the midday meal. I'll be there. She walked out into the daylight and across the yard, and she didn't let the rattle show until she'd rounded the corner of the smokehouse and was out of sight of the barn. Then she stood with her back to the wall and pressed both hands flat against the stone and breathed. 6 weeks. All right. She'd worked with less time than that. She'd done more with less than she had right now. The difference was she'd always been doing it alone. And alone was something she understood completely. Every angle of it. Every way it could go wrong. This was not alone. This was something else she didn't have a name for yet. Nora Reyes came around the corner carrying a basket and stopped short. She looked at Clara's hands flat against the stone, at her face.
She didn't ask. "Midday meal," Nora said.
"You're helping me. Come on." Clara pushed off the wall. She went. Working helped. Working always helped. She'd learned that from her mother, and her mother had learned it from her mother, and it was the most useful inheritance in the family line. You do the next thing. You make the bread. You snap the beans. You keep your hands moving, and your mind follows, eventually. By the time Ernesto rang the bell for the midday meal and the hands came in from the field, Clara had learned the kitchen layout, understood the meal rotation Ruth used for the full crew, and gotten 2 sentences out of Cal, which Nora informed her was approximately a record. She also knew something else, something she hadn't had before this morning. She knew that Ruth Benson had set a place for her at the kitchen work table without being asked. She knew that Nora had talked to her the whole morning, like they'd known each other for a year.
She knew that May had followed Hannah around the yard for 3 hours asking questions, and Hannah had answered every single one. This ranch had already decided something about her. She wasn't sure yet what, but it was deciding, and it wasn't hostile. That wasn't everything. It was far from everything. But Clara Mae Whitfield had learned to count what she had, not what she didn't. And what she had this morning was more than she'd had when she pressed that empty rifle against Wendell Price's chest on the steps of the First National Bank of Creston, Texas. She sat down at the long table with her daughters on one side of her and a hired hand on the other. And Jasper Harrington at the head of the table glanced at her once, just once, with something in his eyes that might have been relief, or might have been gratitude, or might have been something he hadn't named yet either. She looked back. She didn't look away. After all, she told him from the beginning she didn't surrender without a fight, and she wasn't about to start now. He kept his word about the office. Clara came after the midday meal was cleared, and the hands had gone back to their work, and Harrington was already there, seated behind a desk that was covered in the organized chaos of a man who knew where everything was and didn't care how it looked to anyone else. Maps, ledgers, letters in various states of being answered. A coffee cup that had been refilled enough times to leave rings on the correspondence beneath it. He stood when she came in. She noticed that. She'd stopped noticing that kind of thing with Daniel years before he died, because it had stopped being true. And now she noticed it again because it was unexpected. "Sit," she said. "This isn't a social call." He sat. She took the chair across from the desk and folded her hands and waited. He told her about the sister first, the fuller version. Dorothy Harrington Bell had married a San Antonio lawyer named George Bell 12 years ago, and George Bell had spent those 12 years finding legal theories that might give his wife a claim on the ranch their father had left entirely to Jasper. The first 2 attempts had failed in territorial court. The third had found something, a codicil in the original estate filing, language about the property remaining in family stewardship, language that Bell was arguing meant Dorothy had a co-equal right to any decision that affected the property's future. "What decisions has she targeted?" Clara asked. "The timber contracts on the North Range. I signed a 10-year agreement 2 years ago with a mill in Austin. Dorothy's argument is that a decision of that scope required her consent as a co-steward."
He paused. It's a weak argument. My lawyer believes we'd win, but winning takes money and time and the kind of attention I'd rather put somewhere else. So the marriage complicates her standing how, exactly? Belle has been arguing that I've been operating this ranch as a de facto bachelor estate, that I have no intention of building a permanent family presence on the land, that I'm treating it as a business asset rather than a home, which makes the stewardship language in the will relevant. He looked at her steadily. A wife, children, a household that functions as a family. That directly counters his argument. And they'll send someone to verify. They already have. A territorial clerk came through 6 weeks ago, claiming to be assessing property values for the county. Ruth figured out what he actually was inside of 2 hours. By then, he'd already seen that the main house had 1 bedroom in use out of 6. Clara absorbed this. What's the second thing you needed to tell me? Harrington picked up a letter from the top of the stack and set it in front of her. This came 4 days ago. Dorothy and George are coming to San Antonio 2 weeks before the hearing. They're requesting a family meeting beforehand. Neutral ground, they said, an opportunity to resolve things without the court. Clara read the letter. It was written in the careful language of people who are absolutely certain they are in the right, which in her experience was the most dangerous kind of certainty. You're going to refuse. I haven't decided. You should refuse. A meeting on their terms, 2 weeks before a hearing, gives them 2 weeks to use whatever they learn against you in court. There is no version of that meeting that benefits you. There's a version where Dorothy and I reach an understanding without— There isn't, Clara said, not unkindly, but without room for argument. I've watched men like George Bell operate. They don't request meetings to resolve things. They request meetings to gather information and to make the other party feel that refusing was the aggressive move. She set the letter down. What's the third thing? He was quiet for a moment. This pause was different from his others, not calculating, more like something he'd been deciding how to say for longer than this conversation. My brother, he said. Clara looked at him. I told you Dorothy believes the estate was mishandled. What I didn't tell you is that she isn't entirely wrong. He stood up, which was what he did when he needed to think on his feet, she was beginning to understand. Moved to the window, kept his back half-turned. I have a brother, older. His name is Robert. When my father died, Robert he had debts, serious debts, the kind that follow a man. My father knew about them. He left the estate to me with specific instructions that Robert receive nothing because he believed Robert would use any inheritance to settle those debts and then acquire new ones. And I agreed with my father's assessment. Robert had been given money twice before. Both times it was gone within a year. He turned from the window. But I've wondered, since then, whether disinheriting him entirely was the right thing. Whether there was a middle arrangement that would have— He stopped. Robert is in Abilene. He knows about Dorothy's lawsuit. He's been in contact with George Bell. The shape of it became clear to Clara all at once. He's going to testify for Dorothy. Bell approached him 2 months ago. Robert hasn't confirmed or refused yet. But the fact that he's still talking to them tells me enough. What would Robert's testimony establish? That our father's decision was influenced by my relationship with him, rather than by any fair assessment of Dorothy's claims. That I manipulated the situation. He said it flatly, the way you say things you've lived with long enough that the emotion has worn smooth. It isn't true. But Robert believes it. He's believed for 15 years that I was our father's favorite, and that everything that followed was a result of that. He's not lying when he says it. He's just wrong. Clara sat with all of this for a moment. The office was quiet except for the sound of someone, Cal, by the footstep weight, crossing the yard outside. "Can you reach him?" she said. "Robert, before the hearing." "I've tried twice in the last year. He doesn't respond." "Then go to Abilene." "It's not that simple." "I know it isn't simple. I'm asking if it's possible." She kept her voice level. "Because a brother who testifies against you is a different problem than a sister with a legal theory. A jury, or a judge, understands family grievances. They understand brothers who feel passed over. That's a human story, and human stories move people more than codicils do." She leaned forward slightly. "If Robert testifies, Dorothy doesn't need a strong legal argument. She needs a sympathetic one."
"You need to remove that before the hearing." Harrington looked at her across the desk. That reading look again. The one that had started this whole thing on Harriet Boone's front step. "I'll think about Abilene," he said. "Think fast. You've got 6 weeks." "Yes." He sat back down. "I'm aware of my own timeline, Clara." It was the first time he'd used her first name. She noticed it the same way she'd noticed him standing when she entered, filed it away, gave it appropriate weight, moved on. "Is that everything?" she said. "That's the urgent list." "There's a non-urgent list." "There's always a non-urgent list." Something at the corner of his mouth moved in that not-quite smile she was learning to read. "But those can wait." "All right." She stood. "Write to your lawyer today and tell him you're refusing Dorothy's meeting request. I'll tell you the language to use if you want it." "I know how to write letters." "You know how to write honest letters. This one needs to be strategic." She moved toward the door, then stopped. "One more question." "Go ahead." "Ruth, does she know all of this? The full situation?" "Ruth knows everything that happens on this ranch. I stopped trying to manage what she knows about 15 years ago." "Good. Then I'm going to talk to her this afternoon. She needs to know what we're preparing for." He looked mildly surprised. Not at the idea itself, she thought, but at the fact that she'd thought of it. "All right." "She's going to be your best witness to the household, Jasper. When that territorial clerk comes back, and he will come back, Ruth Benson is the person whose assessment will carry the most weight. She's been on this land longer than anyone. Her word means something." Clara paused. "But only if she's prepared. Only if she knows exactly what questions they're likely to ask, and exactly what the truth looks like in a way that serves you without being dishonest." "Ruth strikes me as someone who won't lie for you." "She won't. She never has." "Then she doesn't need to. The truth is enough if it's presented right." Clara opened the door. "I'll be in the kitchen with Ruth. Send for me if anything else comes in from Belle's office." She left, and she didn't look back, and she didn't let herself think about the size of what she'd just agreed to manage until she was halfway across the yard and the sun was on her face and she could breathe at the right pace. 6 weeks to build a household that looked like it had existed for years. 6 weeks to prepare a man who communicated primarily in careful omissions to be transparent in front of a judge. 6 weeks to establish herself in a place where the housekeeper held more authority than the wife, where a 12-year-old was watching her every move, where a brother in Abilene could blow the whole thing apart with one sympathetic testimony. She found Ruth in the kitchen, as expected, working through the afternoon bread with the focused regularity of long habit. "I need to talk to you," Clara said. Ruth didn't stop what she was doing. "I know you do. Sit down." Clara sat at the work table. She laid out everything Harrington had told her, clearly and without editorializing. Ruth listened without interrupting, her hands continuing their work. When Clara finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He told you about Robert?" "Yes."
He hasn't spoken that name to anyone on this property in 3 years. Ruth glanced at her sideways. You understand what that means. It means he trusts me more than I've earned yet. Ruth made a sound that might have been agreement. Or, it means he's desperate enough to trust someone he hasn't had time to distrust. She shaped the dough with 2 steady hands. They're not always different things. No, Clara said. They're not. What do you need from me? I need to know exactly what you'll say if someone comes asking about this household. Not a script. I don't want a script, and you wouldn't use one anyway. I need to know that what you'd say naturally, honestly, is the same story we need told. Ruth was quiet for a moment. What story is that? That this is a home, that there is a family here, that Jasper Harrington has been building something permanent on this land, not just extracting from it. Clara kept her eyes on the older woman. Is that true? Ruth looked at her directly. It's been true since Hannah was born. It just needed the right people to make it visible. A pause. The question is whether you're the right people. You're still deciding. I'm always still deciding. That's how you stay useful. Ruth covered the dough and set it aside. What about the brother, Robert? Harrington needs to go to Abilene. He won't want to. I know. He and Robert haven't spoken in 6 years. The last time they were in the same room, Robert told Jasper their father had chosen wrong, and Jasper told Robert that their father had chosen correctly, and that was the end of it. Ruth's voice was neutral, reporting facts. Robert is not a bad man. He's a man who was told for 40 years that he was second, and he started to believe it. And then the will proved it on paper. She paused. His grievance is real, even if his solution is wrong. Then Jasper needs to acknowledge the grievance without conceding the solution. That's what the meeting in Abilene is for. Clara thought about this, working it through. If Robert testifies for Dorothy because he feels unseen and dismissed, the way to stop him isn't to argue the facts. It's to make him feel seen. She looked at Ruth. What does Robert want? Not the money. Underneath the money. Ruth considered. To be told he mattered. To his father. To his brother. She said it without sentiment, as a simple truth. He wanted to be told it when it would have cost something to say it. Now it's late enough that saying it might just look like strategy. It might be both, Clara said. It might be strategy and still be true. Ruth looked at her. Something in the older woman's expression shifted, not dramatically, just slightly, the way light shifts in late afternoon. You've been married 3 days, she said. 2.5. And you're already trying to fix a 15-year family fracture? I'm trying to keep a roof over my daughters' heads, Clara said. The family fracture is in the way. Ruth almost smiled. It was the closest Clara had seen her come to it. There's coffee on the stove, Ruth said. Help yourself. Then I'll tell you what else you need to know about this family before somebody else tells it to you wrong. Hannah came to find her that evening. Clara was on the porch, in the fading light, writing a letter to her mother. The first letter she'd had time to write, though it was already 5 days since she'd left Creston. She heard the footsteps on the porch boards and recognized them by now. Hannah's quick, slightly impatient stride. The girl sat down on the porch railing without asking, which was a thing Clara decided not to address, because it was a 12-year-old's porch, and she had more rights to it than anyone. Eliza says you used to have a ranch, Hannah said. A small one, more of a farm, really. What happened to it? My husband died, and the bank took it. She kept writing. Debts. Your husband wasn't good with money? My husband wasn't good with quite a few things. She looked up. He wasn't cruel, he was just not suited to the life he was living. Hannah sat with that. My mother was suited to everything,
she said. It came out somewhere between pride and grief, the combination that 12-year-olds carry when they've lost someone too early and the loss hasn't finished reshaping them yet. "Ruth tells me she was brave," Clara said. "Ruth said that to you?" "This morning." Hannah was quiet. Her hands were in her lap, and she was looking at the middle distance in the particular way of people who are deciding how much to say. "She used to race the hands on horseback," Hannah said finally. "She usually won. My father pretended to be annoyed about it." A pause. He wasn't annoyed. He just didn't know what to do with how much he liked watching her beat them. Clara set her letter down. This was not a moment for divided attention. He must miss her very much. He doesn't talk about her. Hannah's voice went flat on this, the way it had gone flat at breakfast when she'd mentioned her mother and then retreated. He hasn't, in a long time. Ruth talks about her. I talk about her with Ruth. But my father just... She stopped. He went somewhere else when she died. Not away. He's here. He's always here. He's just somewhere behind glass. The accuracy of that description for a 12-year-old hit Clara somewhere she wasn't prepared for. She kept her face steady. "Do you want him back?" Hannah looked at her sharply. "That's a strange question." "It's the obvious one." The girl was quiet for a long beat. "I want him to stop pretending he's fine," she said. "I want him to stop asking me if I'm fine when we both know what that question actually means." "What does it mean?" "It means he doesn't know how to say he's sorry," Hannah said, "for being somewhere behind glass. And I don't know how to say it's all right, because it's not all right. And we just keep asking each other if we're fine and saying yes, and nothing gets better." Clara looked at this girl, this 12-year-old, who had diagnosed the problem in her family with surgical accuracy and had absolutely no idea how to fix it, which was the most honest and human thing Clara had encountered on this ranch so far. "I'm not going to pretend to know your father well," Clara said carefully. "I don't yet. I'm not going to pretend I understand what your family was before or what it should be now." She held Hannah's gaze. "But I'll tell you one thing I know from my own experience. Grief makes people go behind glass, and sometimes the only thing that brings them back is someone refusing to accept the glass. I've tried. I know you have. I can see that you have." Clara meant it. "I'm not saying you didn't try hard enough. I'm saying sometimes it takes a different person. Not because you weren't enough. Because the person behind the glass can't always hear the people they love most. The love is too complicated. It reminds them of everything they lost." Hannah was very still. "Maybe," Clara said, "that's something we figure out together, you and me. Without making promises neither of us can keep." She looked at the girl steadily. "What do you say?" The porch was quiet. Somewhere down by the barn, Cal said something to Ernesto in the abbreviated way he had, and Ernesto laughed. "You're not trying to be my mother," Hannah said, not a question. "No." "What are you trying to be?" "Honest," Clara said. "Mostly just honest. We can figure out the rest as we go." Hannah sat on the railing for another moment. Then she said, "I'm going to be difficult sometimes." "I know." "Ruth told you." "Your father told me first." Something moved across Hannah's face. Complicated. Not quite amusement. Not quite something else. She got off the railing. "Good night, Mrs. Harrington." "Good night, Hannah." The girl went inside, and Clara listened to her footsteps cross the floor and go up the stairs. And then it was quiet again, and the last light was going out of the sky, and the letter to her mother was still half finished on her knee. She picked up her pen. She wrote, "I am in a strange place, with strange people,
And I have made a decision that might have been wrong, but I don't think it was. I think it was the bravest thing I've done since I stopped being afraid of your opinion and started trusting my own. Tell me you're all right. Tell me the money arrived. Tell me the nights aren't too quiet." She folded the letter. She looked at the darkening sky over the cedar ridges. Inside the house, through the wall, she could hear Harrington's footsteps crossing his office floor. That measured, deliberate pace that never wasted movement. And she thought about what Ruth had said, about grief and glass. And she thought about a man who'd come to a widow's door at midnight with a bank draft and a careful speech, and the face of someone who'd been alone for a very long time and had stopped expecting that to change. She wasn't going to fix him. That wasn't her job, and she wasn't fool enough to think it was. But she was, it turned out, the kind of woman who refused to accept glass when she could see a real person on the other side of it. That was going to matter soon. In San Antonio, with Dorothy Bell and her lawyer husband, and 15 years of family resentment dressed up as legal argument, it was going to matter more than anything else she could bring to that hearing. Clara Mae Whitfield had arrived at this ranch with 1 bag and 2 daughters, and $11 in her boot. She intended to leave San Antonio with considerably more than she'd come with. She just had to build it first. Jasper left for Abilene on a Tuesday, 4 weeks before the hearing, without telling anyone except Ruth and Clara. He told Clara the night before, after the house had gone quiet and Hannah was asleep and the girls were asleep, and the ranch had settled into its nighttime sounds. He knocked on the connecting door between their rooms, the first time he'd knocked rather than calling through it. And when she opened it, he was already dressed for travel, hat in hand, which told her he'd made the decision sometime in the last hour and hadn't wanted to give himself time to unmake it. "Abilene," she said. "Yes." "Good." She leaned against the doorframe. "How long?" 4 days there and back. 2 days if Robert won't see me and I turn around early. He looked at her steadily. "I don't know what I'm going to say to him." "Yes, you do. Clara, you know exactly what you need to say. You've known for 15 years. She kept her voice even, not pushing, just stating fact. "You need to tell him your father was wrong to make him feel second his whole life, and that you're sorry you didn't say so sooner, and that you want him to stay out of Dorothy's lawsuit, not because of what it'll cost you if he testifies, but because it isn't the truth, and Robert has always known the difference between what's true and what's convenient." Harrington was quiet for a moment. "You've never met my brother?" "No, but I've met men who carry that specific kind of grievance, and they all want the same thing." She paused. "Don't go there with an offer of money. Don't go there with legal arguments. Go there and tell him the truth about what you know your father got wrong, and then ask him to do the right thing and let him decide." She met his eyes. "He might still testify. You have to be ready for that." "I know. But he's less likely to if you've shown him something real." She straightened up. "Travel safe, Jasper." He put his hat on. He started to turn away and then stopped, and without looking back at her, he said, "Thank you for all of this, not just tonight." She didn't tell him it was nothing, because it wasn't nothing, and they'd both agreed to be honest. "Come back with good news if you can," she said. "And come back either way." He left before sunrise. Clara lay awake for another hour, listening to the ranch without him in it, which felt different in a way she hadn't expected. Not emptier, exactly, but differently weighted, like a room where something load-bearing had temporarily relocated. She got up at dawn and went to work. The 2 weeks Jasper was gone turned out to be the most clarifying of Clara's time on the ranch. Without him present, the household's relationship to her shifted in a way that was subtle but unmistakable.
The hands still deferred to Ernesto for operational decisions, and Ruth still ran the house with the absolute authority she'd always run it with. But questions started coming to Clara, small ones at first, then larger. Where did she want the winter stores arranged in the root cellar? Whether the schedule for the south pasture rotation needed adjustment? What she thought about the pricing on the hay contract Ernesto had been offered from a ranch 2 counties over. She answered every question as directly and honestly as she could. When she didn't know something, she said so and asked who would know better. She didn't pretend to authority she didn't have, and she didn't defer when she actually had something useful to say. And she found that people on working ranches respected both of those things in roughly equal measure. Hannah watched all of this. That was the other thing about Jasper's absence. Hannah, freed from whatever complicated performance she ran when her father was present, became marginally more herself. Not easier exactly, but more present. She came to breakfast without the delay. She volunteered information without being asked. She took Eliza on a full tour of the North Range on the 3rd day, the 2 of them gone for 4 hours and returning with dried mud on their boots and an argument in progress about the correct way to read a fence line that continued through supper and apparently resolved itself sometime during the night, because by morning they'd moved on. On the 5th evening, Hannah came to the kitchen while Clara was helping Ruth with the supper inventory and sat at the work table without ceremony and said, "My father isn't behind glass because my mother died." Ruth didn't look up from her ledger. Clara didn't stop what she was doing. She'd learned that Hannah needed the absence of a full audience when she said real things. "No," Clara said. "He's behind glass because he thinks it's his fault." Hannah's voice was careful and deliberate, the way it got when she'd been thinking about something for a long time. She went out in the weather when he'd asked her not to. He'd asked her twice. She went anyway because... A pause. Because she always did what she thought was right, even when it cost her. And the horse threw her, and she hit her head, and she didn't wake up. She was quiet for a moment. And he's spent 4 years believing that if he'd stopped her instead of just asking, she'd still be here. Clara set down her pencil. "Does he know you know that?" "No." Hannah looked at her directly. "Ruth told me, a year after it happened. She said I had a right to know why my father looked the way he looked." She glanced at Ruth. "Was that wrong?" "No," Ruth said, still not looking up. "It was necessary." "He needs to know you understand it," Clara said. "Not to forgive him. He doesn't need your forgiveness for something that wasn't his fault. But he needs to know you don't blame him, because whatever story he's built in his head about what you must think of him, it's probably worse than the truth." Hannah sat with that. "What if I don't know how to say it?" "Then say it badly. Say it wrong. Say it in the middle of something else when it comes out sideways." Clara kept her voice quiet. "In my experience, the people who wait until they know exactly how to say the hard thing usually wait forever." Hannah looked at her for a long moment. That measuring look that was so entirely her father's, and so entirely her own at the same time. Then she got up and went out to the barn, which was where she went when she needed to think. And Clara went back to the inventory. And Ruth finally looked up from her ledger. "You're better at this than I expected," Ruth said. "Don't tell me that. I'll get overconfident." "I'll tell you what I choose to tell you," Ruth said mildly, and went back to her ledger. Jasper came back on a Thursday evening, 6 days after he'd left. Clara was in the yard when she heard his horse on the road, and she watched him ride in and watched his face as he dismounted. And she couldn't read it immediately, which worried her. He handed the reins to the boy and came across the yard, and she walked to meet him, and they stood in the space between the barn and the house, where no one was particularly watching. "Well?" she said. "He's not going to testify." Jasper's voice was flat in the way of something that had been through more than it was currently showing. "He's not going to help Dorothy. He's out of it.
The relief was considerable. She let herself feel it for 2 full seconds, and then filed it away. What happened? We talked for most of 2 days. He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture she'd never seen him make before. Something unguarded, something tired. He said everything he'd been waiting 15 years to say. I let him. Then I said what I should have said a long time ago. He paused. You were right about what he needed to hear. Not an argument, just acknowledgement. Did he accept it? He didn't throw me out. Something moved in his expression. Robert's not a simple man. He's got a lot of years of feeling like an afterthought built up in him. One conversation doesn't fix that. He looked at her. But he shook my hand when I left. That's more than I had when I arrived. That's enough for now. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. He asked about you. Clara hadn't expected that. What did he ask? He asked who you were and where I'd found you, and whether I'd treated you honestly. He met her eyes. I told him I'd tried to. He said that was a more careful answer than he'd expected from me, which was apparently a compliment. A pause. He said he'd like to meet you someday, when things are less complicated. Tell him any time, Clara said, and she meant it. Dorothy Bell's letter arrived 9 days before the hearing. It came in the Morning Post, and Ruth brought it to Clara first, which Clara understood was a statement of several things at once. She read it standing in the hallway, then read it again, then took it to Harrington's office and laid it on the desk without comment. He read it. His jaw went tight and then deliberately relaxed. She's requesting that we present the household before the hearing. A visit. 3 days at the ranch. He set the letter down. She's framing it as wanting to reconnect with family before the legal proceedings. She wants to find weaknesses before she's in front of a judge, Clara said. She wants to see the house and the operation and decide if the household claim will hold up under scrutiny. And she wants to see me. Yes. Let her come. Harrington looked up. Let her come, Clara said again. A refusal looks like we have something to hide. An invitation looks like confidence. She pulled out the chair across from his desk and sat. We have 3 days to show her exactly what we want her to see, which is the truth. A real household. A working ranch with a family in it. Ruth and Nora and the Hands and your daughter and my daughters and a marriage that... She stopped, chose the words carefully. A marriage that is real, even if it isn't what most people would recognize. Harrington looked at her for a long moment. Is it? He said. Real. The question landed differently than she expected. Not as a legal question, as a genuine one. She thought about the last 3 weeks, the office conversation, the midnight door knock, Hannah on the porch, the letter to her mother, the way he'd looked at her across the supper table on the night he came back from Abilene, tired and honest and somehow lighter than she'd seen him. It's becoming something, she said. That's honest. That's enough, he said quietly. For now. She wrote the response to Dorothy herself, at Harrington's request, with him reading over her shoulder. It was warm and direct, and extended an invitation without a single apologetic word in it. She invited Dorothy and George for 3 days, offered the guest room in the main house, and closed with a line that said she looked forward to finally meeting the family she'd married into. Harrington read it twice. You didn't leave them any room to say it's unwelcome, he said. No, I didn't. How'd you learn to write like this? Creditors, she said. Same as everything else. Dorothy Bell arrived on a Wednesday with her husband and a carpet bag that suggested she intended to take meticulous notes. She was a handsome woman,
somewhere in her mid-40s, with Harrington's dark coloring translated into something more carefully arranged. Hair precisely done. Traveling clothes that were too fine for ranch country, and worn that way deliberately, as a statement. George Bell was compact and watchful, with a lawyer's habit of looking at everything in a room before he looked at the people in it. Clara met them on the porch. She had dressed neither simply nor elaborately. A good wool dress in dark blue, her hair up cleanly, her mother's cameo at her throat. She extended her hand to Dorothy first, and then to George, and she smiled with genuine warmth because she had decided before they arrived that being genuinely warm was both the honest thing and the strategic thing, and that this was one of those useful moments when honesty and strategy aligned perfectly. "Welcome to the ranch," she said. "I'm so glad you could come before the hearing. It's easier to know people as people before you know them as opposing parties." Dorothy blinked. She'd prepared for something, Clara could see that. Some defense against some version of this encounter. And Clara had just declined to be the thing she'd prepared for. "Yes," Dorothy said, recovering. "Quite right. Ruth has your room ready. Supper's at 6. Jasper's in the east field, but he'll be back by 4. She stepped aside. "Come in. The house is yours." Ruth was in the entryway, and Dorothy stopped when she saw her, and something complicated crossed Dorothy's face. Recognition, but also something older and harder to name. "Ruth," Dorothy said. "Miss Dorothy?" Ruth said. "Not ma'am. Not Mrs. Bell. Miss Dorothy, the name that meant, I knew you when you were 12 years old, and I've made no decision about what you've become since." Dorothy heard all of it. Clara watched her hear it. George Bell started to say something professional and scene-setting, and Clara talked right over him pleasantly, pointing him toward the sitting room, asking about the journey, offering coffee, moving them through the house with the authority of someone who lived there and knew every room and had arranged this welcome with intention. George Bell was watching her. She could feel it. He was filing things away the same way she was, which meant they understood each other perfectly, which meant this was going to be a very interesting 3 days. She showed them the house, every room. She didn't avoid anything or explain anything away. She showed the kitchen where Nora was already at work on supper, and the sitting room with the books Hannah had reorganized last week by subject matter, and the room where Mae's drawings were pinned to the wall beside Eliza's careful handwriting on a slate board, because Clara had started morning lessons 2 weeks ago, and the evidence of it was visible and unashamed. She showed them the porch and the yard, and let George Bell look at the operation with his assessor's eyes, and she stood beside him while he looked, and didn't apologize for a single thing he saw. "You've settled in quickly," Dorothy said at one point. Her voice was neutral, which meant it was suspicious. "I work fast," Clara said. "Always have." "You must find the ranch very different from what you were used to." "I find it larger," Clara said pleasantly. "The work itself is familiar. Land is land. Animals are animals. People are people." She looked at Dorothy directly. "I grew up working." "That doesn't change with the size of what you're working on." Dorothy looked at her for a long moment, testing something, trying to find the seam in the presentation. Clara held the look without effort, because there was no presentation to find a seam in. This was the truth. All of it. And the truth didn't have seams. Harrington came back at 3:30. He came into the yard dusty from the field and stopped when he saw the Bell's carriage, and his face did something complicated before he smoothed it out. And then he walked to where Clara and Dorothy were standing on the porch, and he looked at his sister with the face of a man who is choosing, actively and in the moment, how to approach something painful. "Dorothy," he said. "Jasper," her voice was careful,
I'm glad you came." He said it simply. Clara heard him mean it, which surprised her. And she thought it probably surprised Dorothy, too, because Dorothy's careful expression faltered for just a moment. "Whatever happens in San Antonio, you're my sister. You've always been my sister. I'd like us to remember that before we're in a courtroom." Dorothy said nothing for 3 full seconds. Then, "That would have been easier to believe 10 years ago." "I know." He didn't flinch. "I'm saying it now because it's true now. What I can't do is go back. What I can do is be straight with you from here." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not going to give you the ranch. I won't do it because it wouldn't be right, and because you know it wouldn't be right. But I've been thinking about what you actually need, separate from what George's legal theory says you're owed. And those are different things. I'd like to talk about that, not in front of a judge, just between us." Dorothy looked at him for a long time. George Bell had come to the edge of the porch and was listening with the professional stillness of a man deciding whether to intervene. "You're telling me this now," Dorothy said. "3 days before a hearing you know we're going to lose." "Robert isn't testifying for you," Harrington said quietly. "Your lawyer knows that by now. And without Robert, the codicil argument doesn't hold the weight Bell needs it to." He paused. "I'm not telling you to run. I'm telling you there's a different conversation available if you want to have it. One where you leave with something real instead of nothing." George Bell said carefully, "Jasper, I don't think now is the appropriate time." "George," Clara said. Her voice was pleasant and absolutely firm. "Let them talk." Bell looked at her. Something shifted in his professional assessment of her. A recalibration, small but definite. He stepped back. Dorothy looked at her brother for a long time. The Texas evening was going gold around them, the cedar ridges darkening against a sky that didn't know or care about any of this. "All right," Dorothy said finally. "We'll talk." The 3 days the Bells spent at the ranch were not easy days. They were days of careful conversation and visible effort on all sides, of George Bell asking questions that sounded casual and weren't, of Dorothy watching Clara with an attention that was part assessment and part something else that Clara gradually identified as reluctant recognition. On the second evening, Dorothy found Clara in the kitchen after supper, alone, finishing the last of the washing up. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and Clara dried her hands and waited. "I expected someone different," Dorothy said. "What kind of someone?" "Someone who married Jasper for what he has. Someone softer, easier to dismiss." She came into the kitchen and sat at the work table, and for a moment she looked less like George Bell's wife and more like a woman carrying something heavy for a long time. "I was prepared to feel sorry for you." "And now?" "Now I'm not sure who should feel sorry for whom." Something in Dorothy's voice had lost its careful construction. "I've spent 11 years on this, 11 years of legal arguments and court filings, and George telling me we were close." She looked at her hands on the table. "And you've been here 3 weeks, and you've changed the shape of everything." "I haven't changed anything that wasn't already true," Clara said. "Your brother built this. Ruth built this. These people built this. She searched for the right word. "I made it visible." Dorothy was quiet. "He was always their father's favorite," she said. "Everything I did, it was never enough. Every time Jasper walked into a room, the room changed." She looked up. "Do you know what that does to a person? Over 40 years?" "I know what it does," Clara said. "I grew up with a mother who compared me to my cousin every time I turned around." She sat down across the table. It makes you decide that the only way to matter is to win.
And then winning becomes the point, instead of what you actually wanted in the first place. Dorothy looked at her sharply. Then, slowly, the sharpness dissolved into something tired and very honest. "What did I actually want?" she said. It wasn't entirely a question. "I don't know," Clara said. "But I think you should ask yourself that before San Antonio. Because if what you want is a relationship with your brother, you can have that. And if what you want is the ranch, you won't get it. And if what you want is to be seen as someone who mattered in that family," she paused, "then maybe the question is whether this lawsuit has ever actually given you that, or just kept you fighting for it." Dorothy said nothing. Clara got up and put the kettle on, because that was what you did when a conversation had gone as far as it could go for one evening. And sometimes tea was the only honest response to a hard truth. Behind her, Dorothy Harrington Bell sat at the kitchen table of a ranch she'd spent 11 years trying to claim. And for the first time in a very long time, she was not thinking about the hearing. She was thinking about what she actually wanted. That was a start. Dorothy and George Bell left on a Friday morning, 2 days before the hearing. There was no dramatic announcement about what had been decided. Dorothy simply came down to breakfast, ate with the household the way she'd eaten every meal during those 3 days, quietly, watching more than she spoke. And afterward, she found Jasper in his office and closed the door, and they were in there for 2 hours. Clara didn't ask what was said. She went about the morning's work and let the conversation be what it needed to be between a brother and a sister who had 40 years of complicated history to sort through in one room. When Harrington came out, his face had the look of a man who had set down something he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten it had weight. He found Clara in the yard, and he stood beside her, and he said, "She's withdrawing the petition." Clara kept her voice steady. "All of it?" "All of it. George isn't happy, but it's her name on the filing, not his, and she's made her decision." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm setting up a trust for Dorothy. Income from the South Range timber, a fair percentage, every year. It's not what she asked for. It's what she should have had from the beginning." He looked at Clara. "You said she wanted to matter, not the money." "I said to ask herself what she wanted." "Same thing, in the end." He paused. "She said something before she left. She said, 'You were nothing like she'd expected,' and that made everything harder and better at the same time." He looked at Clara with the directness she'd come to recognize as his version of openness. "She's right." Clara said nothing, but she didn't look away. George Bell shook Harrington's hand on the porch with the professional courtesy of a man accepting a verdict. And then he looked at Clara with the frank assessment she'd felt from him for 3 days, and he said, "Mrs. Harrington, I'll be direct. You changed the outcome of this. Not the legal arguments, not the financial arrangement. You." He picked up his bag. "I've been practicing law for 20 years. I don't often meet people who can do what you did in 72 hours. "I just told the truth," Clara said. "The truth delivered by the right person at the right moment," Bell said, "is the most powerful legal instrument I know." He nodded at her once. "Good day, ma'am." They watched the Bell's carriage go down the road until it disappeared into the cedars, and then Harrington turned to Clara and said, "San Antonio in 2 days. The hearing is still scheduled. We still need to appear even with the withdrawal to make the dismissal official." "I know. It'll be a formality." "I know that too." She looked at him. "Are you all right?" He considered the question with the honesty she'd come to expect from him. "I think so," he said. "I think I will be." A pause. "She cried before she left. Dorothy. I haven't seen her cry since we were children." He said it like a man who'd just discovered a room in a house he thought he knew completely. "I've forgotten she was capable of it." "People forget that about each other," Clara said, "when the fighting goes on long enough." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said quietly, "they do." They went to San Antonio as a household. This was Clara's decision, stated simply at supper the night before they left. Ruth would stay to manage the ranch. Ernesto and Nora would handle the operation. But Hannah and Eliza and May were coming. Harrington had looked at her across the table when she said it, and she'd looked back, and he'd nodded once, which was enough. Hannah had said nothing, but she'd gone upstairs after supper and come down 20 minutes later with her good dress pressed and folded over her arm, and asked Clara if her boots needed any attention before the journey, which was as close to enthusiasm as Hannah Harrington got, and Clara had understood it exactly for what it was. The journey took 2 days by stage. May asked questions for approximately 6 of the 8 waking hours. Hannah answered most of them with more patience than Clara had expected, which told her something about what 3 weeks of Eliza's company had done for Hannah's tolerance of genuine curiosity versus the performed kind. Eliza watched out the window and was quiet, which was how Eliza processed things that mattered. On the second evening, in the hotel in San Antonio where Harrington had taken 2 adjoining rooms, Clara was helping May into bed when she heard Hannah's voice through the connecting wall. Low, deliberate. The voice Hannah used when she was saying something she'd been holding for a while. She couldn't make out words. She heard Harrington's voice respond, and then Hannah's again, and then a silence that went on long enough to mean something had shifted. She put May to sleep and went to the connecting door and knocked quietly. Harrington's voice said, "Come in." He was sitting on the edge of the bed, and Hannah was beside him, close, her shoulder against his arm, which was the closest Clara had seen them be in the 3 weeks she'd known them. His face had the look of a man who'd just been through something that had cost him, and also given him something in equal measure. "Sorry to interrupt," Clara said. "You're not interrupting." Hannah's voice was steadier than usual, like something had been resolved in it. "I'm going to sleep." She stood up, and she looked at Clara for a moment with those dark, reading eyes. "Thank you," she said. Not for anything specific, just for the accumulation of things. "Good night, Hannah," Clara said. The girl went through to the other room. The door closed softly behind her. Harrington sat very still on the edge of the bed. Clara stayed near the doorway and gave him the space to be in whatever this was. "She told me she doesn't blame me," he said finally. His voice was rough at the edges, in a way she hadn't heard before. For her mother. She said Ruth told her a year after it happened, and that she'd been waiting since then for the right time to say so. He stopped. She said she'd decided there wasn't a right time, and she was going to say it now before she wasted any more of whatever we had left. Clara said nothing. "She's 12 years old," he said, "and she's wiser than I am." "She's had good guidance," Clara said. "Ruth has taken care of her well." "Yes." He looked at his hands. "And you. In 3 weeks." He looked up. "She talks to you." "She talks to Eliza mostly. I just listen when she needs it." That's what she needed. He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know how to give her that. I didn't. After Sarah died, I went somewhere, and I couldn't find my way back to Hannah. I kept looking for the right moment, the right words, and they never came, and the distance just..." He stopped. "It just grew." "It's not grown anymore," Clara said. "That's what tonight was." He looked at her with an expression she didn't have a name for yet. Gratitude, but underneath it something larger. Something that had been building for 3 weeks and had run out of room to stay polite. "Clara, don't," she said gently. "Not tonight. Tonight was for Hannah. Let it be what it was." He held her gaze. Then he nodded. "All right." "Sleep," she said. "Tomorrow is a formality, you said. Then we go home." She said it without thinking about it. Home. And she heard herself say it and didn't take it back. Because it was true. And they'd both agreed from the beginning to tell the truth. She went back to her room and lay in the dark and listened to the city sounds that were so different from the ranch sounds. And she thought about a Tuesday morning in Creston, Texas, standing on bank steps with an empty rifle. And she thought about how many miles and decisions and conversations separated that woman from the one lying in this hotel room. And she decided the distance was not the point. The point was the direction. She had been moving, all of it, in the direction of something more than survival. And she was still moving. That was enough. The hearing lasted 40 minutes. Dorothy's withdrawal had been filed 2 days prior through George Bell's office, and the territorial court judge, a compact, unhurried man named Abernathy, who had clearly seen every variety of family dispute the territory could produce, read through the paperwork with the deliberate pace of someone who refused to be rushed by anyone's nerves. Harrington sat at one table with his lawyer. Clara sat beside him, which was not legally required, and which she had insisted on anyway. Hannah sat in the gallery with Eliza and May, May having been firmly instructed by Eliza that she was not to say anything during the proceedings, and having agreed to this with visible effort. Dorothy and George were present. Bell had filed his client's withdrawal, but professional obligation required his appearance for the formal dismissal. Dorothy sat in the gallery, on the opposite side from the girls. And when Clara came in, she looked at her across the room with an expression that had shed its careful construction entirely. It was just a woman looking at another woman across a courtroom. And what was in Dorothy's face was something Clara recognized because she'd felt it herself. The particular exhaustion of a fight that had taken more than it gave. Clara nodded at her. Dorothy nodded back. Judge Abernathy set down the papers. The petition filed by Dorothy Harrington Bell against the estate administration of the late Edward Harrington has been voluntarily withdrawn by the petitioner. The withdrawal is accepted by this court. The matter is dismissed. He looked over his glasses at both tables. Is there any business remaining before this court? No, Your Honor, said Harrington's lawyer. No, Your Honor, said George Bell. Then we're adjourned. Abernathy stood. Mr. Harrington, take your family home. It was the most efficient justice Clara had ever witnessed. Outside on the courthouse steps, in the San Antonio afternoon, Harrington's lawyer pumped his hand and said several enthusiastic things about the outcome that Harrington received with characteristic economy and quiet gratitude. May pulled on Clara's sleeve and asked if they could eat before they went back to the hotel because she was extremely hungry. Eliza put an arm around May's shoulders and said she was always extremely hungry. Hannah stood slightly apart, watching the street, and when Clara moved to stand beside her, she didn't move away. That's it? Hannah said. That's it. It seemed like it should be bigger. The important things often don't look like much on the outside, Clara said. The work that got us here, that was the big thing. Today was just the closing of a door. Hannah considered this. Then she said, My father's different since you came. Clara looked at her. How so? He talks more. Not to everyone, just... Hannah searched for the word. To the people who matter. He used to manage everything from a distance. Now he's... She stopped. In it, I suppose. More in it. Clara thought about the man who'd knocked on Harriet Boone's door at midnight with a bank draft and a carefully prepared speech, and the man who'd sat on a hotel bed in San Antonio with his daughter's head against his shoulder, while something 15 years broken began, slowly, to mend. The distance between those two men,
was the distance Clara had watched him travel in 3 weeks. She hadn't pulled him. She'd just declined to let the glass be the final word. "He's been in it all along," Clara said. "He just needed someone to hold the door open." Hannah was quiet for a moment. "Is that what you did?" "I think that's what we all did," Clara said. "You and Ruth and Nora and your father himself. I just arrived at a particular moment when it was ready to happen." Hannah looked at her.
The measuring look, the one that was purely her father's and purely her own. Then she said, "I think that's modest. I think it's accurate. I think both things can be true." Clara looked at this 12-year-old girl and felt something warm and entirely uncomplicated open up in her chest. "Yes," she said, "both things can be true." Dorothy found her on the courthouse steps a few minutes later, while Harrington was still talking to his lawyer, and the girls had migrated toward a vendor selling roasted corn on the adjacent street. She came up beside Clara, and they stood together and watched the afternoon traffic of San Antonio pass, and neither of them spoke for a moment. "I want you to know something," Dorothy said, "before we go our separate ways." "Go ahead." "I watched you for 3 days on that ranch. I went there looking for something to use against you. I want to be honest about that." Dorothy's voice was even, not apologetic, just factual. "I was looking for the seam in it, the part where it was a performance, where you were playing a role." A pause. "I didn't find it." "There wasn't one to find." "I know that now." Dorothy looked at her directly. "My brother has not been an easy man to love. He is private and controlled, and he keeps things at a distance as a habit so deep he probably doesn't always know he's doing it. I say this not to warn you. It seems you don't need warning." She paused. "I say it because I want you to know that I am not his enemy. Whatever the last 11 years looked like, I'm not his enemy. I just needed to be seen as something other than a footnote." "You're not a footnote," Clara said. "You're his sister. That's a fixed thing. It doesn't diminish regardless of what any legal document says." Dorothy was quiet. Then, "If you're ever in San Antonio—" "We'll call on you," Clara said. And she meant it with the same completeness she'd meant everything else. They were back at the ranch by Sunday evening. Ruth was on the porch when they rode in the exact posture she'd been in the first day Clara arrived. And she looked at Clara's face and read the outcome before anyone said a word. And she nodded with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had been certain of the result, but had done the work to ensure it anyway. "Supper's ready," Ruth said. "Go wash, all of you." May ran past her into the house, calling Ruth's name. Eliza followed at a more dignified pace. Hannah went up the porch steps and stopped beside Ruth and said something too quiet to carry to the yard. And Ruth put her hand briefly on Hannah's shoulder. Just once, briefly. The touch of someone who has loved this child for 12 years and knows that sometimes love is a hand on a shoulder and nothing more. And then Hannah went inside. Ernesto came to take the horses and clapped Harrington on the shoulder once, the way men do when they want to say something they've decided a gesture covers better. Nora appeared at the kitchen window and waved at Clara with a look on her face that said she'd been watching the road for an hour. Harrington stood in the yard for a moment after everyone else had gone in. He looked at the house, at the light in the kitchen windows, at the smoke from the chimney, at the whole accumulated reality of a life that had nearly been taken from him by a legal argument and 11 years of family fracture. Then he looked at Clara, standing beside him in the yard, still dusty from the road. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Go ahead." "That night I came to Harriet Boone's house." He held her gaze. "I told you it was strategy. The household, the stability argument, the hearing." He paused. "That was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. She waited. "I'd watched you on those bank steps for 20 minutes, he said. Not because I was assessing you for some purpose. I watched you because I couldn't look away." He said it without elaboration, without the kind of careful framing he normally used for things that cost him something to say. A woman with an empty rifle and more dignity than the whole street put together. And I thought, whoever she is, whatever her life has been, she is exactly the kind of person I want in my corner. He paused. Not my household, my corner. Clara looked at him steadily. The yard was quiet around them, cedar and coming dark, and the distant sound of Mae's voice inside the house, asking Ruth something about supper. "That's a different thing than what you told me," she said. "Yes." "You should have said it from the beginning." "I know. I said what I could say from the beginning. The rest took time." He held her gaze. "Is that something you can work with?" She thought about Daniel Whitfield, who had said everything beautifully and meant very little of it. She thought about Jasper Harrington, who had said only what he could verify was true and had arrived, slowly and at some cost, at this moment. She thought about 3 weeks of knocked doors and honest arguments and late office conversations, and the specific quality of trust that is built not from words alone, but from a pattern of actions that keeps turning out to be exactly what it claimed to be. "Yes," she said, "that's something I can work with." He took her hand, not dramatically, just took it, the way he did most things, with economy and intention and without wasted motion. His hand was warm and calloused and entirely real. "Come inside," he said. "Ruth'll have our heads if we let the food go cold." She went inside with him, through the door of the house that had been his, and was now hers too, into the kitchen, where Ruth was already distributing plates with the authority of someone who had managed this household through a great deal, and fully intended to manage it through a great deal more. Where Mae was telling Ernesto with complete conviction that the clouds on the way home had looked exactly like horses. Where Eliza and Hannah were sitting across the table from each other in the comfortable silence of two girls who had decided they were, at minimum, something better than strangers. Where Nora was pouring coffee, and Cal was being monosyllabic in the corner, and the stove was warm, and the room smelled of good food, and the particular human warmth of people who are becoming, against all odds and through considerable difficulty, a family. Clara sat down at the long table. She looked at her daughters. She looked at Hannah. She looked at Ruth, who glanced at her once with those sharp, steady eyes and gave her the smallest nod. The nod that meant, "You did well, girl. Now eat your supper." She looked at Jasper Harrington, who was already talking to Ernesto about the south pasture, who had his daughter's shoulder under his hand in the easy way of a man who has recently remembered that he is allowed to touch the people he loves, who caught Clara's eye across the table and held it for exactly 1 beat before returning to the conversation, which was all he needed to say and all she needed to hear. Clara Mae Whitfield had walked into Creston, Texas's First National Bank with an empty rifle and a heart full of nothing but the stubborn refusal to be finished. She had left that town with 2 daughters and $11, and the fragile, terrifying momentum of a woman who has decided, against all available evidence, to believe that the next door might open onto something better than the last one. She had been right, not because luck had found her, not because a wealthy man had rescued her, but because she had walked through every door that came, asked every hard question, refused every glass wall, held every conversation that needed holding, and had built, in 3 weeks, what some people spend a lifetime failing to find. A place where she was known, a place where she mattered, a place where the work she did was real, and the people around her were real, and the life she was living was entirely, irrevocably, defiantly her own.
She picked up her fork. She looked at her table, her household, her home. Some women wait to be chosen. Clara Mae Whitfield had chosen. And the difference between those two things was the difference between a life that happened to you and a life that was yours. And that difference, it turned out, was everything.